Canada has lost more than 5 million hectares of farmland since 2001. That's roughly the size of Nova Scotia. Gone. And while everyone's been arguing about foreign buyers, they've missed the real story, the one nobody wants you to focus on. For the past few years, there's been a narrative circulating through rural communities across Canada. Foreigners are buying up farmland. Wealthy international investors are scooping up Canadian agricultural land at alarming rates. The Chinese are coming. Middle Eastern oil money is flowing in. Corporations are consolidating. You've heard these stories whispered in coffee shops, shouted on social media, debated in Parliament. Politicians have made it their rallying cry. News outlets have run sensational headlines, and the public has absorbed this narrative as fact, without really questioning whether the evidence actually supports it. But here's what's interesting. When you actually dig into the data, when you pull the government reports, when you talk to the people who study this for a living, a completely different picture emerges. And that picture isn't about foreign investors at all. It's about something much closer to home. It's about decisions made by Canadian governments, about infrastructure development, about housing sprawl, about urban expansion. It's about the fact that we're paving over our most productive farmland to build suburbs and shopping centers and office parks. And while we've been distracted by the foreign ownership narrative, we've allowed something far more devastating to happen right under our noses. Let me take you back to July 2026. On July 11th, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation published an investigation that went virtually unnoticed by most Canadians. The headline was simple: Canada has lost millions of hectares of farmland. Where is it all going? It featured Charles Stevens, a fruit farmer standing on his 66-hectare property about an hour northeast of Toronto. Stevens runs Wilmot Orchards with his family. It's productive land, good soil. And one day, a developer approached him with an offer, $16 million, just for the land itself. That's not a typo. $16 million for the right to develop that land, to turn it from a productive fruit farm into a subdivision or a shopping center or whatever the market demanded. The calculation is simple in the developer's mind. Agricultural land in southern Ontario has transformed dramatically over the past decade. An acre of farmland that cost $8,182 in 2015 sold for $23,400 in 2025. That's a 176% increase in a single decade. The economics are staggering. You can lease agricultural land for a few $100s per acre per year, or you can sell it for development and walk away with tens of millions of dollars. The choice, from a financial perspective, is obvious. Charles Stevens turned down the offer, and his decision to do so, and his decision to take it further by placing an easement on his property, ensuring it could only be used for food production for the next 999 years, this tells you everything you need to know about what's actually threatening Canadian agriculture. According to Statistics Canada Census of Agriculture, data from 2021, Canadian farms reported a 3.2% decrease in total farm area from 2016 to 2021 alone. That's more than 2 million hectares lost in just 5 years. When you extend that timeline back to 2001, the numbers become even more staggering. The Canadian Federation of Agriculture reports that since 2001, there has been a loss of 8.5% or more than 5 million hectares of farmland. To put that in perspective, that's an area roughly equivalent to the entire province of Nova Scotia. That's farmland that was in production, that was feeding Canadians, that was part of our agricultural infrastructure, simply vanishing. Now, where is this land going? That's the crucial question that the foreign ownership debate has successfully obscured. In many cases, particularly in Ontario, it's being consumed by urban expansion. In the Golden Horseshoe area around Toronto, research shows that 85% of all urban settlement from 1971 to 2011 was built on what was once arable land. 85%. That's not a coincidence. It's not an accident. It's the result of municipal zoning decisions, infrastructure development, and the prioritization of housing and commercial development over food production. Trevor Jones is Ontario's Minister of Agriculture, Food and Agribusiness. In October 2025, he began sounding the alarm about foreign ownership. The province introduced a bill that would restrict foreign ownership of farmland, mirroring legislation already in place in Alberta, Quebec, and the 3 prairie provinces. On the surface, this seems like a reasonable protective measure. But Jones himself acknowledged something telling when interviewed. He said that Ontario's concerns were based on anecdotal evidence. Anecdotal, not data, not statistics. Just stories that farmers had told him about neighbors selling land to entities based overseas. When you actually look at the data on foreign ownership of Canadian farmland, the picture becomes far less alarming. Martin Strothoff is the executive director of the Ontario Farmland Trust, an organization dedicated to preserving agricultural land. When asked about whether foreign buyers were actually snapping up Canadian farmland at concerning rates, his response was clear. Little data are available to support arguments that foreign buyers are making a significant impact, But, he emphasized, there is ample evidence that high-value arable soil in southern Ontario is being lost to housing development. That's the real threat. That's where the focus should be. To understand the regulatory landscape around foreign ownership in Canada, you need to understand that it varies dramatically from province to province. And in the provinces with the most prime agricultural land, foreign ownership restrictions are either minimal or non-existent. Ontario, British Columbia, and most Atlantic provinces currently have no restrictions on foreign ownership of farmland. None. An investor from any country can purchase farmland in these provinces without formal caps or limitations. It's only in the prairies, where agricultural land is more abundant, that serious restrictions are in place. Alberta restricts foreign ownership to 20 acres maximum. Saskatchewan's restrictions are even more severe, limiting foreign entities to just 10 acres. Manitoba allows 40 acres for non-residents. Quebec requires foreign buyers to obtain authorization from a regulatory authority. But Ontario, home to the Golden Horseshoe, home to some of Canada's most productive agricultural land, home to the land that Charles Stevens farms, has had no restrictions at all. Until now. This is precisely backward from a food security perspective. The provinces with the strictest restrictions on foreign ownership are the provinces with the most farmland. The provinces with the most valuable, most productive, most strategically important farmland have had open doors to foreign investment. And yet, despite decades of open foreign ownership in Ontario, the data doesn't show a crisis of foreign acquisition. The crisis is domestic. The crisis is development. Let's talk about what the data actually shows about farmland values and ownership. The Farm Credit Canada, which is as close to an official source for Canadian farmland statistics as you're going to get, publishes an annual farmland values report. These reports track price changes across all provinces and different categories of land. In 2024, the national average farmland value increased by 9.3%. That's slower than 2023, which saw an 11.5% increase, but it's still significant appreciation. Saskatchewan led the way with a 13.1% increase. British Columbia followed with 11.3%. These are substantial annual gains. But here's what's crucial to understand. These gains are driven primarily by domestic demand from Canadian farmers and domestic investors, not foreign buyers. FCC's chief agricultural economist has been clear about this. The vast majority of farmland transactions in Canada are between farmers. Farm revenues and interest rates are the primary drivers of land values, not foreign speculation. When you look at who actually owns Canadian farmland, the picture becomes even clearer. One of the most famous cases cited in discussions about non-farmer ownership is Robert Angelic, who owns 220,500 acres, roughly 91,257 hectares, primarily in Saskatchewan. His investment thesis was straightforward. He asked himself, what does Canada have that the world needs and that China can't dominate? His answer was water and agriculture. His ownership is notable precisely because it's unusual. Most farmland in Canada remains in the hands of actual farmers. The agri-food sector in Canada is enormous. It represents over $52 billion annually in business activity. It's the biggest part of Canada's economic pie, according to Ontario's agriculture minister. And yet, the food security threat that Canada faces isn't from foreign ownership of farmland. It's from the steady erosion of that farmland itself through development. Let me walk you through what's happening in Ontario specifically, because Ontario is where this story becomes most acute. In southern Ontario, particularly in the areas surrounding Toronto, you have some of the most productive agricultural land in North America. The soil quality is exceptional. The growing season is long enough for a wide range of crops. The proximity to major population centers meant that this land developed significant economic value, both for agriculture and for development. This created a powerful dynamic. A farmer might own a property worth, say, $2 million at agricultural values, generating maybe $50,000 to $100,000 per year in revenue. A developer approaches and offers $5 million or $10 million or $16 million just to purchase the land outright. The economic logic from an individual farmer's perspective is compelling. You can secure generational wealth, pay off any debts, and ensure your children never have to struggle financially. The fact that this choice removes productive farmland from the food system is not something that appears on the balance sheet. This has been happening for decades, not just in the past few years. The loss of farmland in southern Ontario accelerated through the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s as suburban sprawl expanded outward from Toronto. And while foreign investors may have purchased some land, they were not the primary drivers of this transformation. The primary drivers were Canadian developers, Canadian real estate investment firms, Canadian municipalities making zoning decisions, and Canadian landowners making rational economic decisions within a system that incentivizes development over agriculture. The federal government has recognized this challenge. In 2026, the Carney government released a national food security strategy aimed at spending billions over a decade to produce more food in Canada. The strategy acknowledges that Canada is losing farmland and that this poses a threat to domestic food security. But the response, to some extent, involves developing agricultural capacity in northern Ontario, in the Clay Belt, a region covering Cochrane and Timiskaming in Ontario and Abitibi County in Quebec. This is well-intentioned but also somewhat problematic. The Clay Belt is difficult to farm. The growing seasons are short. The distance to infrastructure is great. The soil requires underground drainage. It's simply not comparable in productivity to the farmland being lost in southern Ontario. Developing agricultural capacity in the north cannot replace what's being lost in the south. You cannot simply relocate food production northward and achieve the same results. Mike Schreiner, leader of the Ontario Green Party, made this point explicitly. While developing agriculture in northern Ontario is worthwhile, it cannot become a distraction from what he calls the real problem, low-density sprawl in southern Ontario. The prioritization of suburban expansion over agricultural preservation is a policy choice, not an inevitable outcome, and it's a choice that has consequences. Let's talk about what's actually happening with farmland values and what they tell us. When you look at a metric called the rent-to-price ratio, you get some interesting insights. The rent-to-price ratio is essentially the annual rental rate for farmland divided by the land's total value. In 2022, Canada's average rent-to-price ratio was 2.55%, essentially unchanged from 2.5% in 2021. This is a crucial indicator. A declining ratio suggests that land prices are increasing faster than rental rates, and that's precisely what's happening in Canada. What this means, economically, is that farmland is being valued increasingly for its potential for development or appreciation, rather than for its productive capacity. If you buy farmland as a long-term agricultural asset, expecting to generate returns through crop production and livestock, the economics don't work at these valuations. But if you buy farmland expecting it to appreciate 8 to 12% annually, or expecting to eventually sell it to a developer, then the economics make perfect sense. This is the fundamental shift that's occurred in Canadian agriculture. Farmland has transformed from a productive asset, valued primarily for its ability to generate agricultural income, into a speculative asset, valued primarily for its potential for appreciation and development. This transformation doesn't require foreign ownership. In fact, it doesn't really care about foreign ownership. It's driven by domestic dynamics, population growth, urban expansion, development pressure, and attractive returns on real estate investment. Now, let's address the foreign investment question more directly. What does the data actually show about who owns Canadian farmland? The honest answer is that comprehensive data on foreign ownership of Canadian farmland is limited. This is partly by design. In provinces that permit foreign ownership, like Ontario, there is no systematic monitoring of foreign ownership. You would need to conduct a detailed investigation of land titles and title holders for each parcel to determine foreign ownership levels. No province currently does this systematically. This absence of data is, ironically, precisely what allows the perception of a foreign ownership crisis to persist. In the absence of clear data, speculation fills the void. Stories circulate, anecdotes accumulate, politicians respond to political pressure, and regulations get tightened based on the narrative rather than on evidence. In comparison, the United States has better data on foreign agricultural land ownership, thanks to the Agricultural Foreign Investment Disclosure Act of 1978. According to USDA data through December 31st, 2024, foreign investors held an interest in 46 million acres of U.S. agricultural land. This represents an increase of 1.3 million acres from the prior year. For context, the United States has roughly 900 million acres of agricultural land, so foreign ownership represents about 5% of all U.S. agricultural land. More importantly, the countries with the largest U.S. agricultural land holdings are Canada, the Netherlands, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Canada holds approximately 33% of all foreign-owned U.S. agricultural land, or about 15.35 million acres. So, if anything, Canadians have been enthusiastic participants in purchasing agricultural land in the United States. The vast majority of foreign agricultural land ownership in North America flows from Canada to the United States, not from foreign countries to Canada. Among U.S. states, foreign ownership is highly concentrated. Maine leads with approximately 15.7% of its privately owned farmland and forest land under foreign control, totaling about 2.82 million acres. Most of this, however, is forest land rather than cropland. Texas has over 5.7 million acres under foreign control, but much of this is range and pasture land. When you focus specifically on cropland, the amount of foreign ownership becomes even smaller. The point here is not that foreign ownership is irrelevant. The point is that foreign ownership of agricultural land, both in the United States and by extension in Canada, represents a relatively small percentage of total agricultural land. It's significant enough to monitor and potentially regulate, but it's not the primary driver of farmland loss or agricultural land consolidation in North America. What is the primary driver? Domestic development, domestic consolidation, and domestic investment. In Canada, specifically, the loss of farmland is primarily driven by urban expansion, particularly around major metropolitan areas. This is a policy choice. Municipal zoning regulations determine whether land near cities gets developed for housing or preserved for agriculture. Provincial governments make decisions about protecting agricultural land. Federal governments make decisions about food security strategy. These are all within the realm of governmental control. Foreign investment is the one element that, ironically, gets the most political attention despite being the least significant factor in actual farmland loss. Let's talk about what investment in Canadian farmland actually looks like from a foreign perspective. According to investment firms that specialize in Canadian farmland, foreign investment tends to be concentrated in provinces without ownership restrictions. Ontario, British Columbia, and Atlantic Canada attract foreign investor interest precisely because there are no caps on ownership. But the scale of this investment remains modest compared to domestic investment. Foreign investors who do purchase Canadian farmland typically do so through family offices, private equity funds, or institutional investors like pension funds. Quebec's pension fund, Caisse de dépôt et placements, announced in June 2021 plans to deploy approximately $2 billion over 5 years in farmland and timberland investments. That's substantial capital, but it's also Canadian capital, not foreign. For foreign investors interested in Canadian farmland, the appeal is straightforward. Canadian agricultural land represents a stable, long-term real asset. Soil quality is excellent in most regions. Water availability is generally good. The regulatory environment is stable and predictable. Property rights are clearly defined and legally protected. Canada's land registry systems provide absolute certainty of ownership, unlike many countries where property rights are ambiguous or subject to political risk. Foreign investors are essentially buying stability, production capacity, and land appreciation potential. They're making investment decisions based on financial returns and diversification, not purchasing into narratives of Canadian food sovereignty. This is neither surprising nor inherently problematic if it doesn't undermine Canada's food security objectives. For policymakers, the question becomes, prioritize Canadian ownership of farmland or preserve farmland itself? These aren't the same objective. You can restrict foreign ownership and still lose farmland to domestic development. Conversely, you can allow foreign ownership while preserving farmland through other means. Ontario's recent regulatory proposal addresses foreign ownership, but does little to address the real threat, which is domestic development. The province is simultaneously proposing restrictions on foreign ownership, while having spent years allowing the conversion of prime agricultural land to residential development in the Golden Horseshoe. It's addressing the smaller problem while ignoring the larger one. Meanwhile, investment professionals in the Canadian farmland sector are straightforward about what's happening. Between mid-2024 and mid-2025, cultivated farmland values increased around 10% nationally, with the first half of 2025 showing about 6% growth. And this is healthier than the explosive growth of previous years, when farmland values were climbing 15% or more annually. But it still represents solid appreciation. And this appreciation is attractive to investors of all nationalities. What's particularly instructive is how foreign investment in Canadian farmland has evolved. Rather than rushing to purchase large tracts, institutional investors are increasingly interested in direct farmland ownership with professional local management. They want on-the-ground expertise, skilled farm operators, access to market intelligence, and ongoing oversight. They're treating farmland as a long-term productive asset, not as a speculative vehicle. This actually aligns reasonably well with Canadian interests. If foreign investment means that farmland remains in productive use, generating income through agricultural activity, then it's arguably better than having that same land sold to a developer and converted to a subdivision. A foreign investor holding farmland long-term and maintaining it productively preserves the agricultural land base. A domestic developer purchasing farmland for conversion to urban use destroys it permanently. This is the paradox that the foreign ownership debate has created. By focusing on nationality of ownership, Canadians have potentially obscured what should be the real priority, preserving farmland itself regardless of who owns it. Whether a piece of land is owned by a Canadian farmer, a Canadian investor, or a foreign pension fund, what matters most is whether it remains in productive agricultural use or gets developed for other purposes. The Canadian Federation of Agriculture, representing actual farmers across the country, has been relatively measured in its responses to foreign ownership concerns. The NFU, the National Farmers Union, has noted that while foreign ownership is worth monitoring, the real challenge facing Canadian farmers is gaining access to land at all. Young farmers cannot compete with investor prices. They cannot match development values. They're being priced out of land ownership, not primarily by foreign competition, but by the combination of domestic development pressure and investment demand. Farmland in southern Ontario that cost $8,400 to $182 per acre in 2015 cost $23,400 per acre by 2025. A young farmer trying to purchase land for genuine agricultural operations cannot compete with these prices. A developer or an investor viewing the land as an appreciating asset can. The fact that the competitor might be from another country is almost a side issue. The real issue is that the economics of agriculture at current land values simply don't work. Farm profitability and farmland values are closely linked. When farming is more profitable, farmers have more capital to invest in land, and land values rise. When farming is less profitable, land values stagnate. This relationship existed long before foreign investment became a political issue, and it will continue to exist long after. Looking at the broader picture, Canada's food system is clearly becoming more precarious. The country has been slowly shifting toward food imports. While many Canadians assume that Canada is self-sufficient in food production, the reality is more complex. Canada produces significant agricultural exports, but it also imports substantial quantities of food from other countries. This works fine during periods of political stability and free trade, but it creates vulnerability during times of international disruption. This is actually what should concern policymakers about farmland loss far more than foreign ownership. When you're losing 5 million hectares of farmland, you're reducing your productive capacity. You're reducing your ability to feed your own population. You're increasing your dependence on imports. That's a genuine threat to food security, and it's a threat that can be addressed through domestic policy decisions about how we use land. The solutions are available. British Columbia introduced agricultural land protection legislation in 1973, establishing an agricultural land reserve designed to prevent the conversion of prime farmland to other uses. While BC's system hasn't been perfect, and the province has still lost some agricultural land, it has preserved far more agricultural land than Ontario has. The regulatory framework exists. The tools are available. What's been lacking is the political priority. Ontario is beginning to recognize this. The National Food Security Strategy represents federal acknowledgement that Canada's farmland loss is a problem requiring action. But solutions need to be comprehensive. They need to include both preserving existing agricultural land and potentially reintroducing agricultural practices in areas where they've been abandoned. They need to consider foreign ownership, yes, but they need to prioritize the larger question of how we allocate our finite land base. As we head into the coming years, the conversation about Canadian farmland ownership and use will likely continue to evolve. The foreign ownership debate will persist because it's politically convenient. It allows policymakers to appear responsive to agricultural concerns without making the harder decisions about development and zoning that would be necessary to truly preserve farmland. But the data tells a different story. The real threat to Canadian agriculture isn't foreign investment, it's domestic development. It's the choice to pave over productive farmland for suburban sprawl. It's the decision that development rights on farmland are more valuable than the farmland's productive capacity. Charles Stevens turned down $16 million because he understood something fundamental. He understood that once farmland is lost to development, it's gone forever. You can't bring it back. You can't recreate that soil quality, that productive capacity, that contribution to food security. His decision to place an easement on his property, committing it to agricultural use for the next 999 years, represented a choice to prioritize food production over financial gain. It's a choice that reflects a different understanding of what our land is for and what we owe future generations. The statistics paint a sobering picture when you really examine them. Between 2016 and 2021 alone, the Census of Agriculture documented a 3.2% decrease in total farm area. More than 2 million hectares disappeared in just 5 years. Project that rate forward, and the implications become clear. We're not talking about a slow erosion. We're talking about active, accelerating loss of productive capacity. Every year, farms close. Every year, agricultural land gets converted. Every year, the total agricultural footprint shrinks. What makes this particularly concerning is that it's happening simultaneously with the increasing complexity of global food systems. Climate disruptions, trade tensions, transportation challenges. These are all factors that make domestic food production more valuable, more strategically important. Yet we're simultaneously dismantling our domestic production capacity by allowing farmland to be converted to non-agricultural uses. The irony is that the foreign ownership debate has actually provided a convenient distraction from this harder conversation. It's easier for politicians to propose restrictions on foreign buyers than to make unpopular decisions about limiting suburban sprawl or protecting agricultural land reserves. It's easier to blame outsiders than to acknowledge that the choices are fundamentally internal. And that's where the conversation needs to move next. Not whether we should allow foreign ownership. That's a valid question, certainly. But the more urgent question is whether we're prepared to preserve our agricultural land base at all. Because if we continue losing farmland at current rates, the question of who owns it becomes almost academic. there won't be enough left to matter. That's the conversation Canada needs to be having. Not whether foreign investors are buying farmland, but whether we're willing to make the difficult policy choices necessary to preserve our agricultural land base for food production. The data is clear. The threat isn't foreign ownership. The threat is development, urban expansion, and a systematic undervaluation of agriculture relative to other land uses. And solving that threat will require political will, regulatory protection, and a fundamental shift in how we value agricultural land and the food system it supports. The solutions require action at multiple levels. Municipal governments need to make zoning decisions that prioritize agricultural preservation over sprawl. Provincial governments need to establish and enforce agricultural land reserves similar to British Columbia's model. Federal governments need to support policies that make farming economically viable so that farmers can compete with developers for land control. And consumers need to recognize that food security has value and that preserving the capacity to produce food domestically matters. Until these broader systemic changes occur, Canada will continue losing farmland at an alarming rate, regardless of who owns it or what policies we implement regarding foreign buyers. The foreign ownership debate will continue, but it will be addressing a secondary issue while the primary issue, the preservation of farmland itself, quietly progresses toward a crisis that could have been prevented through different policy choices today.